But without further ado, let's get into the news. So lately, I know Trump has been in the hospital, and that's pretty much all anyone's been thinking about. But before that, he was launching a really coordinated campaign to try and reduce trust in the election. He keeps talking about voter fraud, even at the debates.
As far as the ballots are concerned, it's a disaster. This is going to be a fraud like you've never seen.
And of course, at the debate also, he did tell the Proud Boys, the Nazi white supremacist group, to stand back and stand by. But more generally, he keeps talking about how he won't agree to a transition of power because he doesn't trust the ballots. And at one point he said, well, we're going to have to see what happens. You know, that I've been complaining very strongly about the ballots, and the ballots are a disaster. Get rid of the ballots and you'll have there won't be a transfer, frankly. There will be a continuation. Now, this is very similar to what he talked about in 2016, of course. You know, if you remember, he was already setting up for complaining about voter fraud and how the election was going to be fake, and then he won. And so he had to kind of stick by it to, you know, act like he wasn't a total hypocrite, but it became very, very apparent that he was totally lying about it. I mean, his intelligence agencies did investigations and nothing came back. And there is no evidence that mail-in ballots are going to somehow have massive voter fraud occurring. But that's not his only strategy going forward to try and steal this election. I mean, he's been talking to Republican state legislators about how he wants to basically have them appoint their own electors to totally ignore the popular vote and just totally steal this election. And the more he can try to contest that vote and push off the day of the election, he can put pressure on them to just make the decision themselves. And the problem is the Republican Party does control a majority of the states. And so he has a whole number of ways of going about this. He can try to delay the election. He can try to just ignore and stop the vote count the night of, which, by the way, we do need to think about this in terms of maybe election week, because the night of the election on Tuesday, it might very well turn totally red on the map. Now, if it's a total landslide, that's not going to happen. But because a majority of Democratic voters are voting by mail and a majority of Republican voters are not, it's very, very likely that as they start to count the in-person ballots, Trump is going to take a massive lead. But that shouldn't freak you out unless he does try to freeze voting during that time. But more generally, Biden will have a majority of his votes come in later, but they can't start opening them until Election Day. So just keep that in mind. But the problem is, even if Trump ends up losing the election in the end, while Mitch McConnell has said, oh, there will be a peaceful transition of power, he has not accounted for the fact that they might just try to steal the election itself, because it's far more legitimate to try and delegitimize the election and say you won it than to say, oh, look, we lost, but I don't care. I mean, no one's going to actually listen to that. Well, the white supremacists will, but, you know, the majority of us will not at all care about what Trump has to say then. But the problem is Trump has fully broadcasted that he's not going to listen to the vote count. And Joe Biden is being pretty naive about his reaction. He said that, I promise you, I'm absolutely convinced the military will escort him from the White House with great dispatch. It's not that simple. I mean, the military, multiple generals now, have said that they won't get involved in an election dispute issue. And this is really a huge problem. I mean, by now, if it's not obvious that Trump is willing to do whatever he has to do in order to become a dictator, I mean, I don't know what's going to become more obvious. He just the other day was talking about how he wants to be in office another 16 years. And that's why we have to all stay aware of this and be thinking about what it is that we're going to do after November 3rd if he tries to actually pull off this coup. Because it's becoming more and more likely that we're going to look like a lot of the countries around the world that we've tried to mess with their elections in. Because he's going to try and pull off an actual far-right coup. And the only way that we can try and stop it is through massive civil action. We all need to be willing to get out into the streets. We all need to be willing to protest and launch other kinds of organizing efforts. And we all need to start thinking about that now. And that, of course, will be a majority of our conversations over the next month. Believe me, I don't want to talk about the election all the time either, but the focus of this show, at least at the start, is going to be on 2020. But after the fact, tons of other stuff to talk about that's always pressing. You know, we'll get to all that. You've been watching Social Point. If you enjoyed this video, please take a second to like and subscribe if you're on YouTube. Follow us on Spotify and iTunes if you enjoy the podcast format. And follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Social Point Pod. Thanks for watching.